I have been meaning to submit this story to you for a while now. I do not have many scary memories or stories, but there is one that always stuck with me ever since I was a little kid, which is when this happened. I cannot remember what state we even lived in at the time, but I know we lived in a small town that felt kinda quaint and pleasant to me. I attended this kindergarten in town. It was a pretty small one with maybe 15 little kids, and it was basically what you would expect. A corner for toys, crappy art on the walls, nap time, a little recess in the yard, and the absolute typical kindergarten. And it would have been completely normal, except for the fact that from day one of me attending that school, there was this one strange kid, and we will just call her Ainsley. She would not join in with the class. She would not read aloud or paint or come outside for recess. She would not do anything except sit in the corner, which everyone referred to as Ainsley's corner. And she did not just sit there either. Oh no. She sat there making little figures out of Play-Doh and then smashing them with her little fist over and over. Or sometimes she would pull the limbs off and then the head. Sometimes she would lie them down and slowly roll the little plastic rolling pin over them. Either way, the end result was that she repeatedly made these Play-Doh people who came to a very sticky end. And from the day I arrived at the kindergarten, I started in the middle of the year because we had just moved to the state. The teachers had already taken to ignoring Ainsley and just letting her do what she wanted. She was not causing any harm or hurting anyone, after all. Naturally, none of the other kids were friends with her. Maybe they tried back in the day, but as far as I knew, they all just ignored the creepy girl in the corner and her Play-Doh playtime. Now, I had a cousin with Down syndrome, and while I could see that Ainsley did not have Downs, I got it into my head that she had some kind of condition, and it was my duty to befriend her and be nice to her. And so, after a couple of weeks of attending the kindergarten and a few more days of building up the confidence, I approached Ainsley in her corner. I was ready for her to just hiss at me, or act hostile, or ignore me altogether. What I did not expect was for her to greet me with this big smile, introducing herself and asking me to sit down and suggest that we become best friends. And yet, that is exactly what happened as a little kid. I remember being slightly taken aback, but hey, this was exactly what I had wanted, right? So I introduced myself too, and sat down, and almost immediately, as if she assumed it was what I wanted, Ainsley began showing me how to make the Play-Doh figurines and the various ways in which I could crush them. She did not explain why we were doing any of this. It was like she figured that I already knew. But she had some particular instructions on how to make what I assumed to be random humanoids. This one had to be short, this one had to have a big nose, and this one needed some big old ears. And it soon became clear that we were making figures of both children and adults. And I would say that there were maybe an 80-20 split between kids and grown-ups. Now, I went along with this for days because I was just happy that I had managed to become Ainsley's friend out of all the kids in class. And it took a while for me to ask why we were doing this and what all this Play-Doh violence was for. And the answer Ainsley gave was not something I had ever heard of before. It was voodoo, she told me. A little kid was talking about voodoo. Now, I'd just like to add here that Ainsley was a Caucasian blonde kid, and as far as I know, she was not from anywhere that really practiced voodoo or any sort of religion like that. And I am as convinced as I can possibly be that this was not some cultural thing, and that she had heard about the concept from one of her older brothers, of which she had 3, 2 of whom were into horror movies and all sorts of weird stuff like that. And I say this very non-judgmentally, because obviously, as a Let's Read fan, I am too. And Ainsley explained what voodoo was to me, which I will not bother recounting because you all know what it is. But the key part here was that we were making these little effigies of our classmates and teachers, and one day, if we were lucky, the gods of voodoo would smile down on us and cause our actions against the dolls to be transferred to the person they represented. I asked Ainsley why we would even want to do this. Why did we want to hurt our classmates and teachers? And she just looked at me like I was some idiot, actually rolling her eyes, and said something like, "Because they are awful, you dummy." I did not really agree, but the look on Ainsley's face made me feel like I really should not voice that disagreement. Once she explained everything to me, I found out that one of the kids was regularly making dolls of what was another girl, who we will just call Kinsley. Kinsley was popular, kind of bratty, and I guess I can see why Ainsley disliked her, even though we were just little kids. And the more Ainsley opened up to me too, the more I came to understand her. It seemed like when she first joined kindergarten, the other kids had actually bullied her a bit. I only know this now as an adult, but there was this whole thing with Ainsley's family, where they were regarded as pariahs in the town, unfairly for reasons I will not get into. And so the kindergarten teachers had never really bothered to put a stop to the torment. Instead, Ainsley had found out about voodoo one day, and that is what set her on this path. I was torn. I did not agree that any of the people really deserved to be dismembered or smashed or squished by gods, but I felt sorry for Ainsley too, so I just kind of humored her. And then, one day, I noticed Kinsley had not been in class for a couple of days, and then the teacher took us aside and told us the bad news, in as sensitive a way as she really could. Kinsley had something called leukemia, a rare kind, and it was very likely that she would not be coming back to school, and we might not see her again. They did not explain the concept of death to us exactly, and at least in the way that I remember it, they did not handle it very well. But the short version is, they told us Kinsley was dying of leukemia. And to me, who did not really understand how these things work, it felt like it had struck her out of nowhere. Obviously, you can see where my brain went as a kid. One of the gods of voodoo had smiled upon us and given Kinsley leukemia, thanks to all the voodoo dolls that we kept making her out of that Play-Doh. And to me, Ainsley and I had effectively sentenced someone to death. And then the next week, my most disliked teacher, Mrs. Harlan, slipped in the recess yard and broke her leg. We made voodoo dolls of her a lot too. I liked making those because they were big fat dolls, and they were fun to smash and smoosh and squash, and I did not like her anymore though. I mulled over everything in my head for a few days. I was the kind of kid who built up internalized trauma real easy. I have no idea why. My parents were not all that strict, and I had never really been in trouble for anything. But I would feel sick with guilt for days or weeks over the dumbest thing. For example, thinking a swear word silently in my head. And eventually, I either moved on from it or confessed it to my mom, who would inevitably just tell me not to worry about it. Now, this time, though, I was certain that I was right to worry about it, and I did not think it was my mom that I needed to confess to, but our main kindergarten teacher. And so, one recess, I went inside and told her everything, how me and Ainsley had been making voodoo dolls, and that we had given Kinsley leukemia. And then we had not stopped there, and we had broken Mrs. Harlan's leg. Now, here is where I think the teacher really messed up, whose name I generally forget, despite how many years I had spent angry at her. Now, she must have been able to tell that I was sincere. She must have. I was crying and struggling to get the words out. I was clearly having a really hard time, but instead of gently explaining to me that this is not how things work, that you cannot create voodoo dolls out of Play-Doh and give classmates sicknesses, and that you cannot make Mrs. Harlan break her leg, this teacher screamed at me. She told me I was disrespecting Kinsley and Mrs. Harlan, and that I was being a horrible little child, and she was seriously considering calling my parents in. I think the only reason she did not was because she knew that she had handled that badly, and she should not have let her anger control how she reacted to me. Now, of course, this all made me feel really, totally awful, so I vented to my only friend, Ainsley, and then, as soon as I realized I had just admitted to Ainsley that I had ratted her out as well. And so then, I started apologizing deeply for that too. And Ainsley just sat there in silence for a while, like she was thinking really hard. I kept talking, suggesting that maybe we should just make a voodoo doll of the teacher, because the gods would definitely smile on us this time. And eventually, Ainsley just shook her head and asked me if I really was sorry that I tried to rat her out. Now, repeatedly, I insisted. I told her I would do anything to prove it. And Ainsley just kind of smiled, and she said she had an idea. We would not make a voodoo doll of the teacher. Instead, there were other ways to do the voodoo god's bidding, and I could prove my support and love at the same time. Now, the next day, she showed me the means of our revenge. It was not anything really complex, and it was not some elaborate voodoo ritual. Instead, Ainsley had a huge kitchen knife in her backpack, and she wanted me to take the knife, come into the classroom when the teacher was alone at recess, and stab her 16 times. This, apparently, would make amends both to the gods and to Ainsley. Now, the story has probably illustrated that I was a pretty naive kid, and it probably makes it clear that I am neurodivergent myself. But nothing, in no way, would have convinced me that taking Ainsley's huge knife and stabbing our teacher repeatedly was okay. And instead, it made me realize that Ainsley was some bloodthirsty psychopath who had a capacity for violence as a freaking kindergartner. Now, I know this because when I refused and told her there was no way that I was going to stab the teacher, Ainsley pulled a pair of small sewing scissors out of her backpack and stabbed me in the leg with them. It was not a little poke, either. It was a deep, rough stab that caused blood to start gushing from my thigh. Obviously, I began to scream, and then so did a bunch of other kids when they saw the bleeding. As soon as it clicked in her brain what she had done, I think Ainsley just gave up. She pulled the kitchen knife from her backpack and lunged at me. However, thankfully, she was just some little girl, and our teacher was not. And she was able to grab Ainsley from behind and very easily pull the knife away from her. I had to go straight to the hospital, so I did not get to see the aftermath. My parents shielded me from most of it too, but what I do know is that Ainsley had to spend some time in an institution and even receive some serious therapy. There are things my parents still will not tell me about the aftermath, even though I am in my first year of college at this point. So I can only assume that something pretty bad, or tragic, or both ended up happening with Ainsley. We moved away to a totally different state right after this, and of course, it is not like you could just Google for news stories about a mentally ill little kid. Now, really all I know is that, for a couple of months, my best friend at kindergarten was a potential killer who believed that she could do magic, and also that I was extremely lucky not to get killed. And that is the part that I do not like to think about. Whenever I tell this story, I try to play it off like I was some badass hero dodging knife swings and surviving some murderer, and it is the only way that I can really stay sane. I know that if I start thinking about it too hard, I will just dwell on what could have happened, and I refuse to do that. And so, this is my story. It could have been a lot worse, but the fact that it was not, and the fact that I am still here to tell the story, is something I am going to focus on above anything else. I know people like to fall asleep to your videos, but I have a story that sometimes still gives me nightmares to this day. I do not know why it creeped me out so much that as an adult, I still sometimes have night terrors and sleep paralysis that revolve around it, but hey, I guess it takes all sorts to scare us. Now, this story was not a serial killer or a gunman or a home invader or anything like that. The scary thing here was a little girl I grew up with. Her name was Brooke, and we grew up together, and we were supposedly best friends. At least, that is what our respective parents insisted anyway. Now, this is going to make me sound like an idiot, but the truth is that I was Brooke's best friend, but she was not mine. Now, before you write me off though, stick with me. I was Brooke's best friend because even from an early age, she did not have any other friends. The reason for this is because she weirded all the other kids out. None of the other kids in the neighborhood, girls or boys, would play with her. She scared them with her odd behavior and the strange things that she would say about ghosts and witches and all tons of nonsense. Mostly, though, she had this habit of hiding in places and then jumping out and yelling at you to scare you. Other little kids do not really like that, and since Brooke made, quote, freaking our friends out her entire personality, they did not really like Brooke either. Unfortunately, Brooke's parents and my parents were best friends. They met in a group since college, and they stayed very, very close ever since, and they both had their first kids, me and Brooke, in the same year. We were born just about a month apart, and so our parents decided that we were destined to be best buddies, just like they were. And ever since we were tiny little babies, we were forced into being a pair. Now, Brooke took this role of friendship very seriously, and that meant that she stuck to my side like glue. And as a little kid, I had no hope of having any other real friendships when Brooke was always there, creeping everyone else out and behaving like a total weirdo. She was also insanely protective and jealous of me, so any chance I might have had at establishing other friendships basically went out the window. Brooke just seemed to have no shame and no sense of decorum or restraint. She would pull weird faces at other kids, and she had no hesitation about breaking wind or burping in front of anyone. She would say extremely hurtful things to other kids, calling larger kids fatty and that kind of thing. And as we moved through elementary school, her vocabulary developed into calling people various slurs, usually things that just made no sense and did not even apply to them. And the fact that I was associated with her as her best friend, it was an embarrassment and absolutely destructive thing to any social life that I might have had. If I even tried to bring up the topic with my parents, they acted like I was being so mean because Brooke was a little angel, and they just would not see the fact that she was some creepy weirdo. The one strange exception to Brooke's behavior was church. Both of our families were Christians, and we attended the same church. And in church, Brooke was like a totally different person. It was as if God genuinely calmed her and soothed some kind of devil in her. Thankfully, the kids at Sunday school mostly were not the same kids from our neighborhood or our elementary school. So we did actually have some other friends there. It was so strange, and to this day, I have no idea if Brooke was putting on some act in church, or she really did just feel compelled to be her best self. Church is important to the story, too, because it introduces the other main characters here, Mallory, our babysitter from when we were really little. Our parents would frequently go out for meals or go to see the movies on Friday or Saturday nights, and Mallory was their choice of babysitter from the get-go. I think she first started babysitting us when she was 14, and we were old enough for our parents to feel comfortable leaving us with someone else. When everything ended, Mallory was 20, although she had never gone off to college or anything like that. Mallory would also babysit us at Brooke's house. There were various reasons for this, but mostly, Brooke had difficulty falling asleep anywhere but her own bed, and our parents would often be out long after it was time for us to go to bed. Brooke had this game where she tried to act as creepy as possible whenever Mallory babysat us, but without Mallory ever finding out. Somehow, she managed this for years. I do not know if Mallory was just completely oblivious and unobservant, or if Brooke was incredibly clever and manipulative. Brooke had 3 different games that she played around Mallory. One was the creepy sound game. Brooke would hide somewhere in the house and make a loud clicking sound with her throat, kind of like that ghost from The Grudge. And then, if Mallory heard, she would convince her that she had no idea what was actually making the sound. I even heard Mallory talking about it to Brooke's parents once, asking if they had ever heard this strange noise. They had not, of course, because Brooke behaved like an angel around adults. And the second game was trying to make me jump and scream. And if she succeeded, I had to tell Mallory that I had seen a spider or a mouse, because just like any other time I tried to push back against Brooke, she would threaten to make my life a living hell. I did not want to find out what kind of horror Brooke would plan for me if she ever decided that I was not her best friend. So I just went along with everything that she threw at me. Finally, the third game was called Goblin. Brooke had this thing where she would pretend to be a goblin, but it was honestly uncanny. She managed to sort of scuttle along the ground on all fours, pulling this genuinely horrifying face. She would hide under beds or climb up on cabinets or wardrobes and act as demonic as she possibly could. And you know how people use that phrase, goblin mode? I am convinced it was invented by someone who knew Brooke. And the way she turned this into a game was going goblin mode for as long as she could without Mallory or other adults ever catching her. One time, I remember her crouching in the corner of the living room, putting her goblin face on while Mallory watched television, and she managed this for an entire hour before getting bored and making me play some board game with her. As we grew up and moved from elementary school to middle school, I really thought or at least hoped and prayed, that Brooke would grow out of her weird, creepy phases. Instead, they just got worse. Middle school presented her with a whole new group of kids to alienate and freak out. Thankfully, middle school allowed me to make a few other friends and vent to them about how much Brooke drove me crazy and how embarrassing I found her. It was not much, but word did start getting around that I was more than Brooke's sidekick and did not actually approve of or endorse her rude, vulgar, and insulting behavior. And this was especially relieving, as she was going through her constantly saying slurs era, usually based on nothing and totally unrelated to the person that she was hurling that slur at. I cannot give examples without getting this video demonetized, obviously. But for example, imagine a slur aimed at a homosexual man being used against an 11-year-old girl, or a little white boy being called, well, you can imagine the kind of things. Now, once again, she just wanted to be as weird and off-putting as possible, and I was starting to get really sick of it. Our parents showed no signs of drifting apart, which meant that Brooke and I were being forced to spend almost every weekend together. Nearly every Friday, they would go out to dinner with a group from church and would not return home until it was well past midnight. So, I would have sleepovers at Brooke's house almost every single Friday. And it was hell. Now, I wanted to start hanging out with my other friends and living a life of my own. I could tell something had changed with Brooke on the Friday that this all kicked off, but I could not put my finger on it exactly. She was sort of aloof with me, acting as if she did not care that I was there. When normally, she would behave like a hyperactive child whenever we had a sleepover. Our parents had been gone for a few hours, and Mallory was downstairs doing some kind of homework, so I guess she must have been attending some kind of school thinking about it. And maybe doing college remotely. I have no idea. Now, anyway, Brooke had told me she wanted some alone time and left me in the living room watching TV, but eventually she told me to come upstairs to play Scrabble. Brooke loved Scrabble because she would make up words and insist that they were real. So she always won. Now, she also enjoyed putting rude words down on the board. When I went upstairs, the Scrabble game was not set up, and instead, Brooke was sitting at her desk, fingers poised like Mr. Burns from The Simpsons, and she stared at me for what felt like minutes, and then finally spoke and told me that she had heard from a little birdie that I had been saying mean things about her at school behind her back. Now, at first, I had no idea what she was talking about, but then I realized I had disavowed her behavior and bitched about her to other kids. And while I do not think anyone ratted me out to Brooke, I think she overheard some kids defending me or saying that I was not as bad as my weird friend or something like that. Brooke said that she knew that I had been calling her a weirdo and telling other kids that I did not like her, so there was no point in denying it. And if I tried, then she would make things worse. And then her face split into this really creepy grin, and she told me that it did not matter. We were still best friends, and if I promised to stay loyal to her from then on, she would forgive me. Of course, being terrified of her and lacking much of a backbone, I begged her forgiveness and promised that I would stay best friends with her. And for the rest of the night, Brooke constantly played two of her favorite games. She would disappear off and make the weird grudge sound, which Mallory had started ignoring years ago, and then she would constantly jump out at me from places to scare me. This time, though, the game changed. I was not allowed to scream or let Mallory know that I was scared. This was now suddenly part of the terms of her forgiving me for insulting her. I think I had pulled it off really well. If I had not stressed it enough, Brooke could be incredibly creepy, and she managed to squeeze into the most impossible hiding spots and jump out from the craziest areas. I think I must have stifled well over 20 screams that night, determined not to invoke whatever hypothetical anger she threatened me with. No, I was just grateful that she did not decide to combine it all with her goblin impression. I am not sure that I could have handled seeing Brooke scooting across the floor out of nowhere that night. I was already jumpy enough as it was. Now, eventually, it was our bedtime, so we headed to our respective bedrooms. And that was one of the things that I did like about sleepovers at Brooke's. They had a guest room, and when I slept over, I was able to use it. Our parents did not like the idea of us keeping each other up by talking all night, and it was a rule that I was more than happy to follow now. And I guess the bedroom also had a lock, and due to Brooke's love for scaring me, I had always locked it before I went to sleep ever since I was young. It had given me a degree of safety, but I found out that night it was completely misplaced. Brooke had always had a key to my room, I suppose, and simply waited for the right time to use it. I had no idea what had woken me up. I blinked in the darkness, trying my best to let my eyes adjust, and then I heard it again. Brooke's stupid croaking ghost noise, and that is when I realized where she was. She was standing on the wooden footboard of the bed, balancing there in some bizarre crouch. Her face was full goblin mode, and she had done something to her hair to make it stick up everywhere. I reached out and turned on the lamp and saw the full, creepy weirdness of Brooke's goblin mode. She was dressed only in her underwear, and she had written all sorts of strange words and symbols all over her body in what looked like lipstick. When she smiled, I saw that her teeth were also covered in lipstick too. And then she spoke in this weird, goblin voice, and I will never forget what she said. "Do you think I am weird enough now?" And with that, she leaped off the foot of the bed and landed on me. And then she began smearing something on my face, which I later found out was the same lipstick that she had used to write on herself. And at the same time, she kept spitting on me, saying she wanted to make me weird like her. I managed to scream, but I think Mallory must have heard the commotion already as she came bursting into the room. And then I heard her screaming. My first thought was that my savior had shown up to finally protect me from Brooke's insanity. But I could never have predicted how Mallory would interpret the situation. At first, all she did was scream at us to break it up. And then she made Brooke put on a robe, march us both downstairs, and had us sit on opposite chairs in the living room until all 4 of our parents returned home. When Mallory told them what had supposedly happened, I could not believe my ears. According to her, she had caught us engaging in some kind of carnal act, that she could no longer be around 2 girls who would behave like that. And the worst part is, Brooke claimed that this was also true, that we had been drawn to each other and needed Jesus. As my parents took me home that night in shame, I begged and pleaded with them to believe me that this was not what happened. I was way too young to even be thinking about anything like that, let alone with Brooke. And they said nothing as I talked over and over about how Brooke had always tried creeping me out ever since we were little kids, how the other neighborhood kids could not stand her, and how she alienated and ostracized everyone at school, how she would say terrible words and act disrespectfully. I told them that, and I thought Brooke needed help, serious help. Eventually, thank God, they believed me. And yet, somehow, this did not make things any better. You see, her parents believed me too, but that what they decided that she needed was some kind of camp for wayward teens, rather than the therapy and support that I had in mind. And so, Brooke was shipped off to what I later found out was a particularly notorious wilderness survival camp designed to scare kids straight into good behavior. And they kept Brooke there for over a year. And then, when she came home, she did not want to see anyone. She was homeschooled. She wanted to avoid me and everyone else. Our parents had remained friends during the whole ordeal of Brooke being at the camp, but as soon as she returned, they kind of just stopped spending time together. And the whole thing conflicts me so much. Brooke terrified me and emotionally hurt and scared a lot of people. But I never wanted her to have her entire personality stripped out of her or be forced to become the shell of herself that camp seemed to have turned her into. Eventually, I heard from my parents that Brooke had decided to dedicate her whole life to Jesus, and after graduation, was set to become a nun. And as far as I know, that is exactly what ended up happening. She has no social media presence, and it is not like she had any other friends I could ask. We lost touch with her parents years ago, and now she is a very strange, eerie footnote in my life. But like I said, sometimes I have these nightmares where she crawls after me on all fours, going full goblin mode, furious at me for the path that I set her on. And sometimes I wake up with sleep paralysis, and I see Brooke standing there on the foot of my bed, just like she was on that final night. Only now, she is not just contorting her face to look like a goblin. In these sleep paralysis fits, she looks fully demonic. And whenever I finally break out of them, and the specter of Brooke seems to disappear, I find myself wondering, did I possibly make things better for my weird best friend? Or did I simply make them much, much worse? When I was growing up during high school, we had a quiet kid in class. You know the type that I am talking about. This was after a major school shooting incident, so quiet kid jokes were told, but kind of in a whispered tone. Nobody wanted to actually trigger the quiet kid, or generally cause anything really bad to happen. And Kellen never actually showed serious signs of violence. Well, mostly, anyway. Occasionally, some of the cool kids would give him crap, and he would lash out and sort of yell at them. And whenever he got angry, his voice became incomprehensible, which really did not help with people calling him an R-word or slow or prospective danger to society. Now, a few things about Kellen that were actually true. His mom cut his hair in a bowl cut. In high school, you would think that she absolutely had to know that this was going to bring the wrath of 1,000 high schoolers down on him. And he also carried a Spider-Man backpack at all times, one from the animated series. And it was before people thought things like this were retro and cool. And so, that was another reason people dunked on poor Kellen. He could barely communicate. If you spoke to him, he would spend so long thinking about what you said that it felt like he was almost ignoring you. And you had to learn to just stand there and wait. And eventually, Kellen would reply. Most times, anyway. Sometimes, he really would just zone out. and you would have to sort of yell his name to snap him back to attention. Now, looking back, Kellen should not really have been in school with regular kids, or if he was, he should have had some kind of helper or something. And instead, this probably autistic, probably mentally ill kid was just left to fend for himself in the Thunderdome that is high school. I was so relieved when the new kid, Brody, joined the school. And he was one of those tall, blonde, wholesome American boys who got along well with pretty much everybody. He excelled at sports. He was smart, the works. And I might have been a little jealous, I got to admit. And so, Brody became friends with basically everyone in no time. But of all the people he hung around the most, it was Kellen. And I guess you could say that he took him under his wing. But it did not feel patronizing or protective or anything like that. He really brought Kellen out of his shell. It turns out that when he was not ostracized and constantly made fun of, Kellen was actually pretty funny and pretty smart guy. He was deeply intelligent, and he was an absolute whiz at chess, and so was Brody. And Brody slowly integrated Kellen into various friendship groups. And for his part, Kellen, shockingly, integrated right back. And it was like this strange, unique, beautiful kid had been waiting beneath the surface for someone like Brody to evolve him. And it was absolutely, utterly tragic that it just could not last. Now, one day, I came in a little too late to school because I did not have class first period. And as soon as I got there, I could tell some commotion was going on. Cops were there, and it looked like they were searching lockers, Kellen's locker in particular. I watched as they bagged something up and removed it from the premises. And shortly after that, a sniffling, crying Kellen was marched down the corridor in handcuffs. Now, here is the story we were told. Brody, as his best friend, had discovered that Kellen was planning to dose the food in the school cafeteria with some type of poison. And this plan had been underway since well before Brody joined the school. But instead of making the most of his newfound popularity, Kellen decided to go ahead with it anyway. Brody had seen the poison in Kellen's locker, and despite his friendship with Kellen, could not let this slide and reported it to the school. One kid's dad was high up in the force and kind of snuck a look at the notes on the investigation, and it looked like they did not have much on Kellen. He was claiming he did not even know what that substance was. And then Brody found the manifesto. It had been hidden behind a false wall in Kellen's locker that he had, and Brody had somehow dug it out, and it detailed Kellen's plan to poison the food, and how on the same day he was going to bring 3 pistols to school belonging to his dad and finish anyone off that way. Brody brought this manifesto straight to the dean, and I guess he really had not thought this through. 1. Why was Brody able to access Kellen's locker, find that wall, and discover this manifesto when the cops did not? 2. Kellen's dad had died many years ago, and while that did not rule out the idea of him owning guns, he had been a staunch anti-gun campaigner, so the idea of Kellen accessing his father's guns seemed ridiculous. 3. The manifesto was supposedly written before Brody even came to the school, but the food that Kellen claimed he was going to poison had not been on the menu until that year. Naturally, this made the school authorities and the cops suspicious. Kellen had been suspended from school at the time, since there was no actual proof he planned on committing a crime. And then the next thing we knew, Brody was no longer in attendance either. It turns out Brody was a psychopath who had been kicked out of his last school for antisocial behavior. His father owned an exterminator firm that specialized in killing rats. One of the few remaining uses of that poison is in rat poison. Kellen would not have been able to get his hands on that type of stuff easily. Brody would have. And eventually, with warrants served, the cops were able to prove that bottles of this stuff were missing from Brody's dad's inventory. And not only that, they were able to get access to the family computer, and what they found was very damning. A saved file containing the whole manifesto. According to the kid whose dad was one of the lead detectives, Brody broke down and sang like a canary. Not a remorseful one, but a proud one. When he arrived at the school and first saw Kellen and heard the quiet kid jokes, he was curious. He wanted to know what kind of punishment would be dealt out to someone who might be a school-based criminal. And he was curious about the effect it would have on Kellen. Rumor has it that when asked, Brody coldly admitted that he was curious if Kellen would commit some kind of act against himself. You know what I mean? I do not know exactly what happened to Brody. He was expelled, but I am not sure what kind of criminal charges were brought against him. His father doubled down on the misplaced poison having nothing to do with his son. And so, we never saw Brody again. And we never saw Kellen either. The whole incident broke him, and I wish I could say that he had overcome his experiences, returned to school, and been embraced by us again. I know we would have welcomed him back, but Brody broke him. Kellen spent the rest of his high school career in some kind of mental institute, and for all I know, he is still there. I have tried to find him a few times, but I have never been successful. And on the chance that you are living your best life, Kellen, and also somehow hear this, I wish you the best. Brody, you seem to be a psychopath, and I hope you ended up locked away for the safety of everyone. Spending my teenage years around someone like you was the most chilling and horrific thing possible, and the way you tortured poor Kellen is unforgivable. Adults can be awful, but kids can be truly, truly evil. Growing up, I was not a small kid. No, I am not going to be ashamed to say it. I was fat. Medically, I qualified as obese, and I suffered from some pretty severe depression following my parents' divorce. There was an emptiness in my life when my mom went off and left us, and I filled the void with food. I am not that person anymore, but I'm not going to be ashamed that I was either. That is the kind of thing that leads down the path that I followed in the first place. And by the time I started high school, I weighed way over 200 pounds, and I was very big. I hated gym class, and I dreaded the showers even more. It is not like everyone in my grade was some jock or anything like that, but I was by far the biggest boy in freshman year. The only upside to it is that I was a tough little guy as well. The bullies soon gave up on any kind of physical violence against me because I could take it. Shove me against the lockers, I would just bounce back. Literally too, I guess. Slap my fat rolls? I had a very high pain threshold. Call me fat? Well, yeah, I knew I was. I could hardly deny it. I did not love hearing it, but just pointing out that I was a big boy only stung internally. And so, yeah, I was bullied, and it did upset me. But I was great at not showing it, and I think a lot of the kids respected that. There was one kid, though. His name was Nolan, and he was as skinny as I was fat. Now, I was pretty short for my age, but he was a whole head shorter than me, a really tiny guy. But he was not some adorable little shorty. Nolan was a mean one, and no mistake. You could tell from the glint in his eye and the perpetual smirk on his face. And rumor had it that Nolan could be such a bully that he once made a senior guy cry. Nobody really seemed to know exactly how Nolan was a bully. Kids just knew to be wary of him and keep away from him. And this resulted in a couple of things. 1. Nolan had no friends. Nobody wanted to actually spend time with him because he was so unpredictable and supposedly volatile. Now, sure, people would be polite to him and nod hello in the halls, but nobody wanted to sit with him at lunch or invite him to social events or anything like that. And 2, it meant that some of the more physical bullies had it in mind to take Nolan down. And that is where I came in. One day, I was sitting alone eating lunch in the courtyard because, like Nolan, I also did not have any actual friends. And so, who should come and sit beside me but Nolan himself? He asked if I wanted half of his sandwich, and to be honest, it did look really delicious. I really did not know what to do. Nolan, this famous idiot, was offering me food. Was there some catch to it? Like it was filled with razor blades or something? In the end, I decided that I was more scared of what would happen if I said no, so I took the sandwich. And this seemed to make Nolan happy, and even more so when I actually ate it. I did not really know what to say after that, so I just sort of asked him if he was having a good day. Nolan ignored my question and told me that he had a proposal for me. Nolan basically proposed that I act as his bodyguard, and in exchange, he would make sure that I was not the target of bullies. I told him I was not really bullied anymore these days, and he grinned, that sort of snide grin that he had, and pointed out that this is because he had left me alone so far. It was a good point. Nolan had never bullied me, and I was not sure that I wanted to find out what would happen if he did. And so, I agreed to be his friend and bodyguard. And this arrangement somehow lasted all the way to junior year. Nolan used me to cause all kinds of trouble. He would pick on certain kids, really vile stuff, and then have me threaten to fight them, or in most cases, take any blows that would have been aimed at him. Sometimes he would force me to beat up younger kids, younger than myself, as we got older. In junior year in particular, we saw a few freshman targets that Nolan took great delight in having me hurt. Now you may be wondering how Nolan managed to have such a hold over me, especially since I was not that particularly thin-skinned. Well, Nolan managed to find that in my armor, my mom. Anytime I tried to push back against Nolan or deny him, then he would throw a barb in my way about how my mother had left because of her disgusting fat son and her autistic daughter and her fat alcoholic husband. Nolan also seemed to know pretty intimate details of the man my mother had run off with and what she was doing now. When I asked Dad about this, he got really quiet and just sort of asked me who I had heard this from, which was all the answer I needed. Nolan was able to use my mother against me quite often, and that hurt. It really hurt. And so I took the path of the coward. I chose to hurt other people instead of letting Nolan hurt me. And I know this makes me a bad person. I regret all of it, but it is what it is now. Like I said, I am going to call things as they are, although in this case, yes, I am ashamed of who I was. Nolan's influence over me almost ruined my high school career as well. My report cards went steadily downhill. Dad never punished me. He just got kinda sad. One time he was a little bit drunk, and he asked where he was going wrong with me and what he could do to help me to get back on track. And it just about broke my heart. And instead of facing up to that, I said something incredibly mean to him that I still apologize for to this day. I told him he could stop being such an embarrassing loser. Now, meanwhile, I developed a reputation at school for being a bully and someone to avoid. So Nolan was my only friend, really, for years. And somehow, Nolan managed to twist things so it looked like I was the ringleader and he was my sidekick. So any trouble we got into, it was usually me who took the brunt of it. I remember one time, Nolan persuaded me to scratch up the paint on the car belonging to one of the most popular seniors in school. If this guy had caught me, I think he was one of the few people in the school who would actually outdo me in a fight, and he would have pummeled me into the ground. Thankfully, we got away with that one. Towards the end of junior year, Nolan developed a crush. The girl in question was an unassuming, bookish girl who was quiet and kept to herself. You know the type. Now she was also the girl that I had had a crush on for the last year as well, and I am pretty sure that Nolan knew this. Nolan told me that he had a plan to ask her to date him. He just needed some time with her in the art classroom, and I had to stand guard to make sure nobody came along and unlocked the door. Now, I might have been a dumb kid, but I was not stupid. I knew that there was absolutely nothing good about what Nolan might have planned. And so, this one time, I said no, and Nolan went nuts. Apparently, there were a lot of things that he had been holding back, things that he knew about my mom, and according to him anyway, how my stepdad had been abusing my sister. And then he had all this evidence on his phone of my involvement in all the bullying, cut and edited in a way that looked like I was the sole culprit. In particular, there was minutes of footage of me vandalizing the senior's car. Nolan threatened to reveal this to them, and to reveal to the whole school the kind of loose woman my mother was, and how she was allegedly pimping out her own daughter. And at that moment, I saw red. By this point, a lot of my fat had turned into muscle, and I had a huge growth spurt. Nolan was still tiny. I picked my bully up by the waist. I slammed him down on the table into the empty classroom we were conspiring in, and the crack I heard was almost as terrifying as Nolan's screams. I knew I had done something really, really terrible, something even Nolan did not deserve. And when it all came out, I did not protect Nolan, but I did not try to protect myself either. I deserved a lot of the blame, and I wanted to take it. After this, being sent to a military academy was my own choice. I had scared myself stupid with my own rage, and I had hurt people, and I had gotten out of control. Nolan's family wanted to press charges, and the military academy also served as a compromise. And this is also how I found out that the man my mother had left the family for was Nolan's father. This whole time, my new stepdad was Nolan's biological dad, who walked out on Nolan's family when Nolan was just a baby. And I can only guess that the whole thing was intended as some sort of roundabout revenge against me in the end. Military school was the making of me, really. And I took it like a duck to water. I graduated and then joined the military, where I stay there to this day. I hate the person I used to be, but I'm proud of the person I have become. And I heard that Nolan took a very darker path and never tried to better himself. To a larger extent, I blame myself for this. I certainly see him as a victim in many circumstances. I try to make up for who I was every day. I serve our country. I donate to charity. I send money back to my dad to help my sister's care. Thankfully, Nolan's claims of abuse towards my sister were lies aimed to disgrace his dad. Apparently, he is not even that bad of a guy. I do not want to know him, though. I just want to keep making amends for allowing one of the most effed up people I have ever known to dictate, dominate, and destroy my childhood. You may finish this story by hating me and thinking I am a terrible person, and I would not blame you. But I am trying. I wish Nolan had done the same, and from what I understand, he has done some pretty terrible things in the years since I have known him, and I can only hope that one day he takes his first steps onto the road to redemption that I am attempting to walk myself. You cannot take back the things you do, but you can try and make amends for them, even if it is too little and too late. When I was younger in high school, I admit that I was a bit of a stoner, a sort of emo goth type who probably did not take care of herself that well and smoked a little too much weed. Now, this was before weed was legal too, so we could not just walk to the store and pick some up. We would spend our weekends hanging out in this sort of cubbyhole under a bridge, not like the one from that famous dancing video you probably remember, and we would turn it into a bit of a hangout space. Rugs, magazines, a battery-powered stereo, the works. Now, one rule was, if you showed up, then you brought snacks. And there was one guy who did not follow that rule, or any of them really, and his name was Beaumont. And that was not really his real name. I imagined that. But that is what he insisted we call him. Because get this, he had been to Beaumont in Texas once, on a vacation for like a month. And there were a bunch of ways Beaumont did not fit in. He was not a goth or emo. He was more of a hippie. And he was this white dude with dreadlocks, although I am not sure if they were dreads or whether his hair was really just that never arrive with snacks either, and he would never contribute free stuff to the den. He would just stroll in and hang out while the rest of us put the work in. And while some of us might not have the best kind of hygiene, Beaumont had absolutely reeked of BO, and whoever got stuck sitting next to him, usually one of the girls, would have to develop a tolerance to his smell. Oh, and did I mention that Beaumont was 32? A 32-year-old stinking hippie hanging out with high school goths and emos. And he was not shy about hitting on some of the girls in the group. So, you are probably asking, why did we tolerate him? And the answer was simple. We were young, dumb, and he would buy us alcohol and provide us with weed. For a price, mind you, which he made no secret about skimming a profit from. He just showed up one day, told us that he could hook us up just as we had been wondering how the hell to get into substance abuse. Spoiler, just do not. And he sort of just stuck around ever since. And so, Beaumont, despite all of his flaws and age gap and being a creep, was very much always at our hangout. He acted like he was the king of the castle, and we were his adoring servants, especially the women. Even though all of us resisted his quote-unquote charms, he behaved as if we constantly lusted after his stinky-ass body. He was gross, to put it mildly, and we were dumb enough to let him stick around anyways. And there were maybe 8 of us, including Beaumont, on and off. 4 girls, 3 high school guys, and this Beaumont guy. 2 of the guys were far too much of losers to really ever stand up against him, and one of them was as much of a predator creep as Beaumont was. So, Between Beaumont and the southern weirdo, whose name was Jasper, us girls really had to watch ourselves. We just moved into junior year when Beaumont ramped up his behavior. He singled out a couple of the girls, they were named Sadie and Bree, and started trying to get them to engage in some really strange actions with him. At first, he offered free joints in exchange for this, and then it was an entire free baggie of weed. And then it was weed and unspecified pills. He must have been really desperate to get touched, as that is all he was aiming for, to start with, anyway. And a rumor went around that Sadie did actually give in, and even did some strange stuff with him for a bag of weed. And we did not see her for about a week. And when she came back to the group, she seemed down and ashamed, and would not look anyone in the eye. And we got the impression that whatever experience she had had with him had not been a good one. And knowing how pressurizing Beaumont could get, I could only imagine. Now, none of us wanted to bring it up with Sadie, in case it was not that. But behind her back, most of the boys were not sympathetic, especially Jasper. Well, obviously the girls felt bad for her, and we began talking about how to get rid of this Beaumont, but the boys were having none of it. He was our free ticket to weed and alcohol, and we were not losing that just because Sadie wanted a freebie. These little... I am not going to pretend Sadie was innocent in this whole affair, but if you knew Beaumont, you would know how far he would try to go to get what he wanted. And the fact that it had taken until now was a miracle. The thing that changed everything was when this new girl joined junior year and quickly became a member of our group. Her name was Sierra, and ironically, she had almost jet black hair, completely natural. And she soon became one of us, and Beaumont was smitten. And so was Jasper. This was the first rift. Sierra was one of those girls who was confident, and she dressed provocatively, but she had no interest in doing anything with a dude. And so began a competition between Jasper and Beaumont to be the first one to get Sierra without clothes. They were not trying to sleep with her, not yet, anyway. They just made a bet to be the first one to consensually see her. And the consensual part was not out of respect or anything. It was just for bragging rights between these two weirdos. Naturally, Sierra did not appreciate this from the start. Having two guys, one of whom was literally 32 and stank, trying to get her to do something like flashing. And she began asking some of us privately why we tolerated this weirdo. And so we explained. And then she asked why we tolerated Jasper. And we started realizing that there really was not actually a good reason for that. He was a creepy idiot too, but he normally targeted girls outside the group. There were all sorts of rumors circulating about the way he treated past girlfriends. Sierra decided she would try to handle it, and her solution was to offer some kind of vague incentive to Jasper or Beaumont, to whichever one beat the other in a fight, and very clearly beat, no question that they had won. That is, she meant one of them to put the other in the hospital. Sierra had expected them to say no, that it was not worth it. But apparently, this high school boy and this 32-year-old man were willing to risk killing each other over seeing some girl's body. And so, it was decided that the fight would be that Friday night. Sierra had become my personal best friend, really. So she was panicking to me on the telephone about this. And of course, she did not want anyone to get hurt. She just wanted both of them to just screw off. We could not think of any solutions other than to try and de-escalate the fight, or call the cops if we really had to. And ultimately, none of that needed to happen. We all showed up to the hangout on Friday. Beaumont made some disgusting, crude comment about how he was going to win the fight, and Sierra would be compelled to do all sorts of unspeakable things. And that is when he attacked. Only the attack did not come from Jasper. Now, remember, I said the other two guys who were too much of babies to ever stand up against Beaumont? Well, it turns out that was not true. One of them, a guy named Colton, suddenly went flying across the room, slamming Beaumont against the concrete wall of the hangout and pinning him there by the throat. Colton was a big guy, tall and large, and he had no problem holding the skinny, wiry Beaumont guy in place. And it all came out. How much we all hated Beaumont, and how he was a stinking, vile parasite who could only get with women by trying to bribe children with drugs. How none of us could stand him. Basically, everything we had ever wanted to say to him. You see, we found out later that Colton had been developing a burning, powerful crush on Sierra, and the more Beaumont and Jasper talked about her like that, the more quietly and fuming he got. And then he just snapped. We watched in silent awe as Colton head-butted Beaumont square in his nose, audibly breaking it, and we listened as he threatened to gut him violently if he ever showed his face around the hangout again, or even around town. And then he pulled the hunting knife out of his belt. That is the exact moment Jasper walked in, looking sick and nervous, presumably for his fight. You would expect this to distract Colton, but it did not. He held the knife up to Beaumont's throat so tightly that it drew beads of blood and told him how serious he truly was. And then Colton dropped some info we did not know. He mentioned the name of his family, a well-known Irish-American gang in town who were, to say the least, serious business. And when Beaumont heard that is what finally broke him. He began to cry, begging forgiveness and apologizing to Colton. And Colton said it was not him who deserved the apology. It was Sierra. And Sierra just shook her head and said she did not care. She just wanted this guy out of there. So, Colton let him limp away, and that was the last we ever saw of that creepy drug dealer again. Now, meanwhile, Jasper had been watching the whole thing with a sort of sick look on his face, as I said, and Colton turned to him, tucked the knife back into his belt, and just gave him this look that sort of said, "You could be next." And the group kind of dissipated after that. Nobody really had the energy to hang out with each other, with all that violence hanging in the air. And Sierra and I stayed friends, and the other girls and guys sort of drifted away. We are still friends to this day, and sometimes Sierra and I talk about how we were regularly hanging out with 3 different guys who were scary in their own way. And there was Jasper, who I later found out got kicked out of college for his conduct with a female student. And then there was Beaumont, who, looking back, was more terrifying than I truly realized. An adult male trying to use intoxicants to get underage women into bed with him. And while he was maybe the least dangerous, Colton was definitely the scariest. Nothing suggested he would explode that day, and nothing gave away that he was the black sheep of an extremely violent family. And all we can be grateful for is that Colton's first outburst of rage was directed at the right target. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. Hope to see you there. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. New video out now. Go check it out. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, if not friend, why friend shaped?